to record now. Please mute yourself. Okay, let's get started. And Jane, if you could admit people, I would appreciate that. Okay. And I'm recording. Good. Good evening, and thank you for attending our program, 250 Years of American Art. Our presenter is art historian Jane Oneail. Join us in celebrating America's extraordinary artistic legacy as we commemorate our nation's 250th anniversary with a curated exploration of the masterworks that have defined our cultural identity. Funding for this free program is provided by the Friends of the Hamden Library. My name is Elisabeth Angerle. I am responsible for information and patron services at the Hamden Public Library. Before I introduce you to our presenter this evening, I would like to do some Zoom keeping and mention two upcoming library programs. Please note that we will record this program. I will send out a follow-up email with the recording link. We also have permission to upload the program to the library's YouTube channel. To achieve the best sound quality, everyone should be muted. When you want to participate in the discussion, please unmute yourself. There are different ways to do that on the microphone icon on the left-hand side of the Zoom toolbar. Simply click on that or hold down the space bar on your computer or hold down the Alt key and the letter A. Once you have finished sharing your thoughts, please mute yourself again. I would like to mention two upcoming library programs. We are in the middle of a very snowy winter, but some of us are thinking about spring and gardening already. The Magical Gardens of Bunny Mellon will be presented by landscape designer Jennifer Yates on Zoom on February 10th, 2026 at 6:30 p.m. Bunny Mellon, who died at age 103 in 2014, is perhaps most known for the redesign of the White House Rose Garden during the presidency of John F. Kennedy. She was an immensely talented and very influential designer and gardener. Find out how she made art with her gardens. Are you interested in researching your family's history? Then you should attend our program, Getting Started with Family History. It will take place on Saturday, February 14th at 10 a.m. in the Friends Room of Miller Library. Sign up for these events online on our Hamden Library website, hamdenlibrary.org, or call the information desk at 203-287-2680. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our presenter this evening, Jane Oneail. Jane Oneail curates and delivers art appreciation programs to audiences throughout New England. She holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. Thank you for presenting this evening, Jane.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to do this nice sort of sweeping review of American art tonight. We are going to move through a great deal of history very quickly. So I want all of you to sort of strap yourselves in. You might get a little dizzy. It was a lot to take on, 250 years for about 1 hour, but we're going to do it. We're going to be looking at the art that defined us, that challenged us, and that changed us. We will be getting back to this image on the screen in
That
just
all
a
went
moment.
through. That all seemed to go
For
smoothly,
now, I'm just going
as far
to
as I'm aware.
double
So,
check that if everybody could
um,
double check and make sure that they are muted, that would be helpful.
yeah, we took
Um,
$200 per
for
kid
now,
plus
let me give
150
you a
for the
sense in
mom,
terms of how we'll spend
and
our time
then I think
together.
Melissa got
We are going to be
reimbursed.
moving through the paintings tonight chronologically. So we're going to get started with some of the earliest major works in American history, portraits, some history paintings, and some gorgeous Hudson River School paintings as well, landscapes. And then we're going to sort of come crashing down to the ground with the Civil War and move all the way up through the end of the 19th century through the Gilded Age. Then we have this wonderful kind of fertile period in between the Great Wars. So we have the Harlem Renaissance, we have social realism and regionalism to unpack. And then we have America moving to the forefront. America comes out from beyond Europe's shadow and we become the leaders in the world of art. What does that look like? Abstract expressionism. And then after that, we head into the 1960s and we sort of get back to what America does best, which is consumerism, right? We go shopping with Andy Warhol. We do a little bit of pop art and a little bit of protest art. And we will wrap up tonight looking at diverse perspectives on what art can be and who can make art too in America today. So let's get started. We have a lot to cover. We are going to dive right in with some of these earliest works, and this first work is really sort of your no name object. It's a placeholder object just to remind us that when it comes to looking at American art, we are dealing with art that's very much influenced by Europe, and there's a long shadow from Europe that is cast over America, where we have a little bit of an inferiority complex, and we also have the challenge, the struggle to keep up with what Europe was producing. Artists in early America didn't have access to formal training. They had limited access to reproductions of great works of art, and they certainly never set foot in museums while they were here in the early years of the Republic. So what they were doing was doing their best to copy what Europe was producing. So you get these kind of quirky portraits sometimes with colonial into early American art. This one's from 1725. And as you can see, there's some sort of wonky proportions here, very long torso, very short legs. A nice little stab at linear perspective, but those tiles are just a little bit off too. So, what we have in early American art is oftentimes aspirational. People in the New World want to show they made it big, right? But but it is endearingly kind of offbeat like this too. But it is uniquely American in that way. Now, all of this changes by the time we get to John Singleton Copley. John Singleton Copley was like our first homegrown self-taught artist, and this is, of course, his painting of Paul Revere. And this is a knockout of a painting. It was done in 1768 before Paul Revere's famous ride. This is like an icon of the Museum of Fine Arts. What we are looking at here is an artist who is able to fully render the illusion that we are looking at another person, that the frame of this painting is literally just a window frame, and we're looking out onto an illusionistic world, a world where, you know, table surfaces shine and silver teapots shine, and these beautiful billowing shirt sleeves look so very realistic to us. Now, the other astonishing thing that John Singleton Copley has delivered with this portrait is that he is sitting face to face with another artist, a craftsman, and he's presenting him here with the tools of his trade. But he's not just somebody who works with his hands, he's an intellectual too. He's cupping his chin in this wonderful pose that suggests so much thoughtfulness here. So by now, American art is not just aspirational, we have arrived. Now, that isn't true for every artist. Many early American artists actually had to go to London or other parts of Europe in order to learn how to paint, including this artist here whose name is Benjamin West. And in the 1700s, Benjamin West was very interested in history painting, and he wanted to do history painting for America, this baby of a country. So he thinks of Penn's legendarily peaceful treaty with Native Americans, which had happened about 100 years earlier. And he uses basically the design principles of European history painting to put together this imagined scene. William Penn with the Native Americans. So we have this peaceful gathering here. But what I want to emphasize to you is that our artist here, Benjamin West, is basically just taking these European rules and applying them to American subjects. Even though we're getting our first quick look at Indigenous peoples here, this is in no way a reflection of their culture or even time spent or observed by the artist. This is literally just applying an appearance to like a bearded philosopher type that you might see in a European painting. But now we've got a little bit of history. And this changes too when we turn our attention to the artist John Trumbull. John Trumbull had been an aide to General George Washington during the Revolution. And about 10 years later, he started painting pictures of the Revolution. This is his image of the death of General Warren and the Battle of Bunker Hill. So now we have eyewitness events that artists are rendering into major history paintings to codify how we think of the revolution that started this country. What a powerful position for an artist to be in, right? But even young John Trumbull was relying on art historical precedents in order to create an image like this. It's very easy to fall into the trap that what we're looking at is like a document of what actually happened. But even Trumbull was thinking of images of the Lamentation, the dead Christ. How do you make an image of a martyr? You look back at religious painting that came before you. So we see Trumbull borrowing a little bit of that from in order to create this image that even he was an eyewitness to. But it makes for some good drama here, doesn't it? Now, there's all this struggle for power on this battlefield here. We have another field of power when we look at this family portrait of George Washington. This is from 1796. The artist is Edward Savage. And here he is really trying to play up every sort of political lever and sort of position of power that George Washington had. So notice that right by Washington's hand is his ceremonial sword. Even in his wife Martha Washington's hand, she's got this little fan, but she's pointing to a spot on this map of Washington, D.C., where the future White House is going to be. Their grandchildren are there accompanying them, sort of securing this legacy. And even the little boy has these like little pincers in his hand. These are, I believe, they're called calipers. And he's resting his hand on this globe, which curiously does not have any countries on it, but simply the act, the gesture of resting your hand on a globe typically refers to global domination. So it's all about power here. Now, Edward Savage also included this fifth figure here, who's not a member of the family, but almost certainly one of George Washington's slaves. Art historians believe that he's probably Washington's personal valet, a man by the name of William Lee. Now, Savage probably included him in the painting as another way to indicate power, another way to sort of suggest the Virginian plantation roots of George Washington. But by including this Black man at the edge of this picture, the artist Savage here also inadvertently documented the moral contradiction that is at the foundation of this country. We're seeing just our first glimpse of Black people in American art, and we're going to see see that it's a really interesting dynamic that plays out over our 250 years. We're going to stay with George Washington for just a moment. We're going to turn our attention to this unfinished portrait by the celebrated portrait painter Gilbert Stuart. And this might look like a familiar image because we all actually own this one. This is the painting that's in our back pockets in the form of the $1 bill, right? We've all seen this face before. So why does it make sort of like our top most important paintings in American art list? Simply because of the way that Gilbert Stuart painted it. Here he is painting the leader of this young nation. And what is he telling us about him? Well, first of all, there's no crown, there's no military uniform. This is a man of the people. And we can also see this incredible restraint in the face of George Washington. Part of that might be the uncomfortable dentures, but another part of it is like this is a man who is reserved, he has dignity, he is the very embodiment of Republican virtue here. He is our accessible face of democracy. He's no king, right? So what Gilbert Stuart managed to achieve in this very simple, very humble, unfinished portrait is to essentially document the very face of democracy. And man, it has some staying power, right? Like I said, we all have one. Now, our next image, we're going to pivot away from Washington just for a moment. Our next image is our first artist self-portrait. And we're going to be seeing a heck of a lot more over the course of the hour. The artist here is Charles Willson Peale. Here is the artist in his museum from 1822. We get a little bit of that Republican virtue here as well, but there's also a little bit of showmanship, right? Lifting the curtain, come on into what I've collected here. Now, Charles Willson Peale, in addition to being an artist, we can see his painter's palette and brushes over here. He was a naturalist. These are cases and cases of taxidermied birds. On the other side of him, the excavated skeleton of a mastodon that he himself was involved in excavating. So he is giving us this orderly sense of the known world here. Our first glimpse of what it is to be a professional artist in America is in one part, sort of that reserved, dignified, aspirational sort of Washington type. But the other part of it is the idea of an artist as someone who builds institutions, an artist who is interested in making knowledge accessible to everyone, somebody who's interested in the natural world. So our earliest artists are quite sort of like Renaissance men in many ways. So let's keep that in mind. We'll be looking at other artists, but for right now, we have to pivot back to George Washington for just a beat, because how could we talk about American art without talking about Washington crossing the Delaware? This is a painting by the German-born American artist Emanuel Leutze, and believe it or not, this painting was done about 75 years after the American Revolution. So it has very little to do with what actually happened that night. Believe it or not, art historians have so many problems with this painting. I, for one, actually love the fact that he gave us this wonderful cross section of soldiers in the boat on that frozen night. But he's also giving us two different sources of light over here. He actually painted a version of the American flag that didn't even exist at the time. And almost certainly, if George Washington was standing in the boat in this way, would have tipped the boat over. Most art historians, too, are quick to point out that the kind of ice that we see here, supposedly on the Delaware River, it is not what you would see in America, but in Germany, where the artist was from. This is one of the largest works in the American collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it is almost always on view because it's a crowd favorite and because it's huge and it's hard to handle and store it. So if you're there at the museum, you're likely to see it. What we have to keep in mind, though, is that this is not in any way a document of what happened on that icy Christmas night back in 1776. Instead, it's what Americans needed to believe what happened. George Washington was a symbol by this time, an important unifying symbol as the country was approaching the Civil War. We're going to be approaching it too, but we're going to take a quick detour and breathe in these gorgeous landscape paintings, these Hudson River School landscape paintings. Now, in the 19th century, you have all of these landscape painters who are sort of struggling to define how do Americans think of their landscape. They had a little bit of an inferiority complex too, because Europeans had beautiful classical ruins to paint that gave their landscape so much character and history. Well, what did we have in America? We had the landscape primeval, a wilderness that was a little bit scary. And we get sort of both worlds in this painting by Thomas Cole, who's like the leader of the Hudson River School of Art. This painting is called the Oxbow from 1836. And he's almost split the painting right down the center. And on one side, we've got, crazy weather. There's some lightning over here. A tree has just been blasted. And then on the other side, we have calm and peace and sunshine and this cultivated, knowable landscape. Notice too that the artist included a little tiny self-portrait at the forefront here. He's been hiding from the weather himself. So he's basically asking us, what is America going to be? Are we going to maintain this medieval wilderness that we have, or are we going to cultivate it? We sort of get an answer from our next artist here. This is another German-born American artist named Albert Bierstadt, famously traveled out west and painted the Rockies. This painting is called Among the Sierra Nevada Mountains from 1868. And his answer here is America is a landscape worth worshiping. This is wilderness as a cathedral. We have these towering peaks, we have crystalline waterfalls, and we have this golden light that is pouring through the clouds like a blessing. Now, just to give you a sense of the scale of this particular painting, Bierstadt painted these huge works. This isn't the dark, dangerous forest anymore. This is America's salvation. This is painted on such a scale, it demands our awe. So Bierstadt has turned these mountains and these valleys into proof of America's greatness. Now, interestingly, in this painting, he has omitted any reference to the indigenous peoples that he certainly saw when he was traveling out west, but that was for his intended white audiences in this case. One last Hudson River School painting for you here. It's a knockout. This is by Frederick Edwin Church. It's called Twilight in the Wilderness, and it is from 1860. This painting is the standard by which every sunset is now going to be measured for you. These red streaks in the sky that sort of mellow out to the pink out here, the golden light of the sun that is just dipped behind those purple mountains. I mean, this is like a symphony of color in the sky. This is America as pure visual spectacle. This is nature performing for us. It's glorious, right? It's amazing. And then as the country falls into civil war the following year, the same artist reinterprets that sunset and turns those red streaks of clouds in the sky into the American flag. This one's called Our Banner in the Sky. And now he is showing that essentially God is blessing America through nature itself. The landscape is literally wrapped in the colors of the flag as the nation goes to war. I told you you'd never see sunsets in the same way again. So now we're going to come down from the heavens to not just the ground, but the battlefield. Are you ready for this? We are looking at an image of the Civil War, actually one of the most popular, most enduring images of the Civil War, that was produced by an artist named Winslow Homer, one of the most celebrated artists of the 19th century. Now, part of the reason this image had this kind of staying power is because it could be seen very differently by people on different sides of the conflict. So what we're looking at is called Prisoners from the Front. It's from 1866. And this is like an encapsulation of this, of the win of a battle by on the part of the Northern Army. So this is a Union officer over here. This is actually a cousin to the artist. So he's certainly thinking about celebrating this figure here. And he is confronting these three Confederate Southern soldiers here who are the stand-ins, representative of the entire Confederate Army. And we can see that there's a lot of difference between these three Confederate soldiers. One of them is young, sort of haughty. He's got this like long hair, seems a little defiant, right, with his hand on his hip. The next is a much older man. He's wearing these very ragged clothes. There's a sense of humility in his posture, I think. And then we have a young man who seems like a rough and sort of restless country kid. He's like hardly even wearing a uniform. He looks like he's out on an adventure, right? So what is going on here? Essentially, Winslow Homer is showing us, I think sort of the Northern Union side would say, look at how desperate they are for soldiers, that they're using these young men, these old men. This is a ragtag army. And at the same time, the South could look at this and say, look at how dedicated to the cause literally every person was in the South. That's something to be proud of. So this is the image that was so often used in history books, even to illustrate the Civil War, because it had that little ambiguity to it in terms of understanding the different sides here. Now, this same artist, Winslow Homer, returned to the South. He went to Virginia about 10 years after the Civil War during Reconstruction. There's no sorts of ambiguity in this picture called The Visit from the Old Mistress. This is at the Smithsonian Museum. So now we have this new dynamic between this white woman who was formerly a slave owner and the Black women here and the child who she had previously owned. And so now she has come into their space, and we see these sort of varying reactions to her presence here, something it sort of defiance mixed with a weariness. I see those slumped shoulders. Someone who doesn't even seem to be directly looking at her hasn't stood up when this white woman has entered the room. So certainly she's not welcome there. We have Winslow Homer delivering to us this very tense scene. The tension is palpable in this room, right? But what he doesn't give us is any way forward. We don't know what's about to transpire. We don't know what the future of these relationships are going to be like. So instead of painting that very tough to grapple with the future that we have to contend with, we have other artists who are working in this realistic strain, who then turn their attention to what's known as genre painting. Genre painting is scenes of everyday life, just ordinary subjects. And the artist here is Eastman Johnson. He had a studio on Nantucket Island, and he was a leading genre painter at this time. This is his work from 1871 called The Old Stagecoach. Isn't it sweet? We have all these kids that have poured out of this, presumably like a one-room schoolhouse, have run into this sunny field, and now they're playing pretend on this old stagecoach that no longer even has wheels. It's their improvised playground. This is an integrated scene. There are Black and white children playing together, and it's like the very embodiment of the sweetness and innocence of childhood here. So now we have this new shift in terms of what art can even focus on. The simplicity of childhood becomes a subject. And I think there's probably a little bit of yearning for that, what America was like before the Civil War, really. Now, you have other artists that stay in this realistic idiom, but they turn their attention to more serious subject matter. And that would include the artist Thomas Eakins. This is his painting called The Gross Clinic from 1875. We've left those sun-dappled fields, right? And now we are in a dark amphitheater where we are watching not a scientific experiment, but actually a surgery taking place in front of us. So we have all of these medical students in the background who are leaning in to see it, or maybe casually bored watching it. And we have Dr. Samuel Gross, whose white hair is sort of giving him a little bit of a halo effect here. And we have his hand dipped in that red blood. His assistants here helping out with this surgery. This is on the side of the thigh of his patient. These are the bottoms of his socked feet. His head would be up here. He's being anesthetized. So there's like a cloth over his face. This is probably his mother who's covering her eyes from what's happening here. So there's this sense of a belief in science. There's a belief in medicine here that is melding so beautifully with the kind of realism that Thomas Eakins was able to create at this time. Now we are going to take realism to the nth degree. We are going to turn our attention now to grand manner portrait painting, and nobody did that better than John Singer Sargent. John Singer Sargent was an American expat. So he spent most of his life in Europe, and he painted this work here while he was in Paris. He was just 28 years old when he painted it. This is his famous Madame X from 1884. Now, this was a young socialite in Paris, famous for her unusual and distinctive beauty. Everybody wanted to paint her. And so he's captured her in this distinctive profile in this sort of a va-va-voom of a dress that's maybe a little bit ill-fitting here, but showing a lot of this flesh. We've got this sweetheart neckline, and notice the way her arm is kind of twisting to land on the edge of this table. It's sort of popping her chest out just a little bit too. There was a seductiveness about this painting that was so over the top that it created quite a bit of a scandal. People thought this is too bold, it's too sensual, it's too crass, it's too American. And it didn't help the fact that John Singer Sargent had originally painted the jeweled strap of this woman's dress falling off her shoulder. One critic wrote in response to this, "One more struggle and the lady will be free." It's like her dress is going to fall right off. So there was an uproar against this painting. John Singer Sargent repainted the strap firmly in place and then essentially fled Paris with his tail between his legs because there was such vitriol against this painting. He kept it in his own studio for the next few decades, ultimately selling it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, saying, "I suppose it's the best thing I've ever done." Sometimes scandal makes a masterpiece. The next artist I'd like to introduce you to, you probably already know her, is another American that was in Paris at the end of the 19th century, and that would be Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt, what a hero. She never got married, left Pennsylvania, and then went and was invited in to the circle of artists that would become known as the Impressionists. She was the only American, the only outsider invited into that group, but she was not the only woman artist in that group. And as a woman artist, her movements about Paris were really restricted. You'd have to have a chaperone to do just about anything. So Mary Cassatt began to specialize in images of tea time, in images of women and their children in nurseries. And so instead of painting, city life and all that Paris had to offer, she's sort of cloistered, sort of sequestered into these domestic spheres, essentially. But she painted them so well that she really elevated this subject matter being worthy of our consideration as a subject for high fine art. Now, this next artist is sort of our homegrown Impressionist. He was the leader of the American Impressionist movement. This would be Childe Hassam. And he had strong ties to Connecticut, strong ties to New Hampshire, too. This is the Isles of Shoals here, an island just off the coast where he spent 30 of his summers visiting his friend Celia Thaxter, who had this beautiful garden. And you can see the Impressionist brushwork on full display here. Impressionism being these like quick, visible, broken brush strokes that he is not attempting to blend at all. And the end result is you feel like you're sitting right there in this garden with the wind whipping these little flowers all around you. Over here on the right is one of Child Hassam's paintings of the flags of World War One. This one is called Avenue in the Rain from 1917. It's actually in the collection of the White House. And we've got these drenched, heavy flags on a wet day in Paris. The shiny concrete, all these little figures making their way under their umbrellas. And we can see that Hassam could apply this brushwork just as well to a city subject. And what we're going to do now is fully turn our attention to the subject of the city. The city becomes this launching point for creativity right around the turn of the century as we head into the 1900s. And what we see over here on the left is a painting by the artist Robert Henry. It's just called New York in Snow. It's probably what New York looked like just a couple days ago or still today. And we can see little people and the slush in the street and that sort of thing, and tenement buildings. Robert Henry was a leader of a movement that came to be known as the Ashcan School of Art. Ashcans sort of being like places where you would extinguish your cigarettes. They were essentially like trash cans. And the idea here was that the Ashcan School of Art would paint all the gritty, grimy things that you would never want to include in a fancy painting before this moment. So we have something similar with the image over here on the right. This is a painting by John Sloan from 1912, and it's called Sunday Women Drying Their Hair. And these might as well be women on the roof of one of these tenements, right? These are working class women doing, I mean, personal hygiene, essentially. Again, not a subject that you would ever thought of to be worthy for a painting. But now we have just the mere fact and the novel fact of city life as being a focus for so many artists. And we'll see that remains true for several decades. We have two paintings here from the 1920s by Georgia O'Keeffe. Before she became known for all things New Mexico, she lived in New York City. And even though it was sort of an uncomfortable fit for her, she focused her attention very often on skyscrapers, even though her art dealer husband told her that there were still men who were trying to figure out how to paint skyscrapers. Leave it to the men. But she persevered and she made these iconic images of the Radiator Building over here on the right and the Sheldon Hotel over here on the left. Georgia O'Keeffe actually lived in the Sheldon Hotel. She was actually one of the first American artists to live in a skyscraper. It's so funny to me. It's like it feels like the skyscrapers have been around for forever, but it was just about 100 years ago, and people were still kind of grappling with how do you paint it. Georgia O'Keeffe would paint the monolith, reduce the geometry on the surface of these buildings, right, to just a few of these rectangular windows. And then she would find a way to kind of soften these forms, oftentimes with steam or billowing smoke. She would include sunspots over here or little glowing street lamps over here, just to give us a little bit of the natural world or natural forms in these cityscapes. Now, another early modernist artist was also working in New York and for decades was associated with the city, and his style never really changed. That would be Edward Hopper. This is a much later painting, but it's just as similar. It's very similar in style to what he was producing in the 1920s, and I couldn't leave it out of tonight's program. This is his 1942 painting called The Nighthawks. We've all seen it before. It's been very parodied, right? So, whenever I think of Edward Hopper, I think of this one scholar who said Edward Hopper makes a voyeur of us all. He has us peeking through people's windows and trying to figure out what's going on. In this case, we're walking down a city sidewalk, presumably in the middle of the night. There's no signs of life. And here is this brightly lit diner with these four individuals who seem to be sort of engaging with each other, but we can't really tell. Are these two people together? Is this person part of the conversation? We don't really know what's unfolding. But he gives us this giant plate glass window. It's almost like a movie screen. You want to sit down and see what happens next. Edward Hopper made it a point to never make this story clear. He always wanted the mystery to endure. And I think for this work, it certainly still does. What we're going to do now is stay in New York City, but we're going to head uptown. We're going to go to Harlem now. We're going to take a look at that very fertile period in between World War I and World War II. We're going to get started with the Harlem Renaissance. And this first painting here is a knockout. This is a painting by an artist named Archibald Motley from 1925. Archibald Motley is a professional artist, and he's showing us that very fact in this painting, right? Which just seems, um, uh, pretty straightforward. But we have to keep in mind that Archibald Motley was just two generations removed from slavery. His grandmother had been a slave. And when we think about the system of slavery and the fact that it outlawed, banned, forbade so much creative expression. You couldn't read, you couldn't write, you couldn't make images. And now, 2 generations later, we have professionally trained artists wearing 3-piece suits who are making these images of themselves in the world, putting out there that they are now artists who are telling their own story. That is short of miraculous to me when I think about it. So we have this wonderful image of Archibald Motley essentially showing us everything that he is with and in doing so kind of suggesting the evidence of everything that tried to prevent it as well. Now, another major facet of the Harlem Renaissance was this idea of Afrocentrism. So I mentioned before, slavery tried to destroy creative output from people who were enslaved. And so I think for many African Americans during the Harlem Renaissance, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, they're thinking, what is our cultural history? What's our legacy? And Afrocentrism sort of provided the answer. It was going all the way back to Africa, all the way back to ancient Egypt. So in Lois Mayu Jones's painting over here on the left, called The Ascent of Ethiopia, we have this Egyptian pharaoh in profile over here. In Aaron Douglas's painting on the right, called Building More Stately Mansions, we've got another Egyptian profile. And in both of these pictures, we sort of get this progress from ancient Egypt to the modern era, where there's learning, there's arts, there's drama, there's music. And what a history to claim for yourself too. Because I mean, ancient Egypt, the wonders of ancient Egypt still dazzle us to this day. And they were created so long before even Europe became a place that was thriving. So this was African Americans basically saying that this was their cultural inheritance and celebrating it. Now, I have one last work from the Harlem Renaissance, which is a knockout. This is our first sculpture, and it's by the artist Augusta Savage. It's called Gamin. You can probably see the name right there. It's from 1930. Gamin basically is like French for like a little streetwise boy, but in this case, we know this is a portrait of her nephew. Now, what seems like a straightforward depiction of a child here is actually using a format of a sculptural bust that goes all the way back to like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, really, where they focused on the head and the shoulders. So this is the way you convey an image of an emperor. And now it's being used to show us a black child in his full humanity, his individuality, his own integrity here, his intelligence, his dignity. And we can see a real individual. I love these kind of streetwise eyes that he has here, kind of knowing eyes, a little set jaw. He's not a type, he's just a kid. But prior to this moment, artists in the history of American art weren't really interested in the full humanity of a Black child. So this is a pretty rare and precious work that we're looking at right now. This is an artist saying they had the right to represent Black life on their own terms. Now, are you ready for a little bit of whiplash? Because we are leaving Harlem and we are headed to the heartland. And there is not a lot of heart or humanity in this picture. This is Grant Wood's American Gothic, which is probably one of the most famous and the most parodied works in American art. It's coming up on its 100th anniversary. What do we make of this painting? Well, first of all, the name American Gothic. We have these two figures here who are standing in front of a Carpenter Gothic inspired farmhouse just behind them with these vertical clapboards here. Now, we are looking at a father and a daughter. We oftentimes assume that it's a husband and a wife. They both have these severe expressions on their faces. And the interesting thing about this work is, again, it can be read sort of both ways. It has that same sort of flexibility that the Civil War painting had. People can look at this and think, well, these are God-fearing, salt of the earth types that are, they're like my neighbors. Or you could look at it and sort of think they seem kind of silly, sort of small town, provincial, and maybe a little rigid, right? And the artist here, Grant Wood, never told us if this was supposed to be celebratory or satirical. So depending on kind of where you live or how you feel on a certain day, you might see it as one or the other, which is why it kind of has this staying power in American culture. This is our first example of regionalism. I have one more for you. The artist here is Thomas Hart Benton. And we've got our sort of Midwest subject, in this case, a painting that's sort of inspired by a folk song. This is called The Wreck of the Old 97. It's from 1943. We have a fast mail train that's going off the tracks. We have a near collision here. I love Thomas Hart Benton's paintings because there are these undulating lines in everything he painted, from fences to corn stalks to people's bodies to the roiling land itself. Everything sort of feels like this line that is moving, gives everything this dynamic energy. But what makes this regionalist is that it's like everyday subject matter. It's kind of like celebrating a story of like working class people in this case. And what we're going to see as we head into social realism is that we stay with working class people, but we've got a different perspective now. The artist here is Ben Shahn. This is his painting called The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti. Sounds religious, right? There is a quasi-religious element to this painting. This is from 1932. Ben Shahn did a whole series on the trial of these two men, Sacco and Vanzetti, who were accused of murder in Braintree, Massachusetts, back in the 1920s. And they were ultimately found guilty of this murder. But there was, believe it or not, global outrage and protest at their sentencing because people felt like they were being targeted just because they were immigrants, also anarchists. So we have Ben Shahn producing a series of images. This is probably his most powerful image because our subjects have died. They are in their caskets here, and presiding over their death is like this three-person tribunal that was asked like 7 years after the fact whether or not to uphold the sentence of death for these two men. It was the president of Harvard, the president of MIT, and a former judge. And this three-person tribunal said, yes, these men are guilty. And so we have this kind of mournful scene where we have our kind of dispassionate judges here standing over the death of these men. We call this the passion of Sacco and Vanzetti because we have this sense of like an unjust death here. If you're wondering about who's in the background, this is the judge who presided over the original trial. So we have this sort of strange scene. It's sort of Byzantine, it's kind of stiff, it's iconic, but it is not neutral. We have social realism, artists who are now advocating on behalf of working class people. They're using their highfalutin art in order to advance a cause. It's not just to celebrate American culture, it's to say what's right and what's wrong. We see that again in one more social realist painting. This one's by Philip Evergood. It's from 1937. This is called American Tragedy. And what we see here is an actual event that happened that same year. There were steel mill workers in Chicago who were striking, and the police force showed up that day and killed 10 of them. Who had been peacefully demonstrating, essentially. So what we see here are it's like this violent clash We see unjust deaths. We see people who are on the ground bleeding and battered. We see people who are being shot in the back. And and once again, we have an artist who is using his paint and his canvas to advocate on behalf of working class subjects. Now, nobody's going to accuse Norman Rockwell of being a social realist, but I think that there is an interesting shift as we get into the 1940s here. Norman Rockwell painted his Four Freedoms in 1943, and you could sort of cynically call this propaganda for World War II. And it did, in fact, help to raise these four images, did in fact help to raise $132 million for the US Treasury during World War II. But these are also images about American ideals. We have the freedom of speech, we have the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. Norman Rockwell had been galvanized when he listened to FDR talk about these freedoms, freedoms that he believed every human on the planet should have. And Rockwell wanted to tell the stories of those freedoms. So he paints people who look like your friends and neighbors playing out these freedoms in our everyday lives. And in doing so, in the middle of World War II, Norman Rockwell is reminding America of the values that we wanted to protect and to preserve. Pretty powerful stuff. Now, post war, things change a little bit. This is our last painting in this section. This is Andrew Wyeth's very famous painting, Christina's World from 1948. This is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. What is modern about this? A woman in the grass by what looks like an old farm, right? Well, what is distinctly modern about this is the psychological shift that we see post war. This is a painting where we don't see the subject's face, but we see her kind of sitting on her hip here in the grass, her upper body oriented towards that house in the distance. And we feel the anxiety, we feel the desperation, we feel the yearning. I mean, I think we could sort of project all of those things onto this painting. And these are subjects in American art that up until this point really had not been the focus. So post-war, post-Holocaust, post-A-bomb, things are shifting. And man, do they shift for us as American artists, because now we take the lead with abstract expressionism. This gives rise to Jackson Pollock. We are looking at his massive painting called Autumn Rhythm from 1950. Now, America is taking the lead in part because Europe is in ruins after World War II, but we also have an innovative approach to painting now. And the idea here is we are going to acknowledge the very fact of what painting is. Painting, really since the Italian Renaissance, had been this illusion, the frame of a painting being like the frame of a window, and it would create this illusion of a three-dimensional space through that frame. Think of Paul Revere and Copley, right? But now, by 1950, we have artists that are saying painting is simply paint on canvas. It's not an illusion. The purest form of painting is acknowledging that pure state of painting. So we have Jackson Pollock, who is throwing and tossing and dripping skeins of paint onto a canvas that he had on the floor. You spend some time with this, you see a little bit of the structure to it. You can probably see these like right angles, these hard edges that he's using with some of this tan paint. There's some white paint in here that he looks like he's kind of splattering, and then he's got these skinnier lines that go out with it. We have even some green paint in here too, but as we look at the black paint, which is so visible, we can see these very like long tendrils, these almost calligraphic lines that he's creating too. So when it comes to Jackson Pollock, we think of, I mean, the pictures of him creating his images are almost as important as the images themselves, because it's not just this pure form of painting, it's also capturing his gestures and, beyond that, his psychological state as he was creating this. So now all of a sudden, art doesn't have to be representational, and it can really be about the internal life of the artists themselves. We see something similar happening in, here's just another look at this same painting, Autumn Rhythm, which is on such a grand scale. It's just amazing, isn't it? But we see something similar happening with this next work by the artist Willem de Kooning. This is his 1952 painting, Woman One. It's also abstract expressionism, but he hasn't completely abandoned representational art. We still have the human form, in this case, a terrifying woman with her teeth kind of bared. We can see, drips and slashes of paint. Believe it or not, de Kooning kept painting this and then scraping the paint away and then painting it again and scraping the paint away. Did this for like 2 years before he arrived at this solution. And so, again, it's almost like a record of his internal thought process, of his moods, of his state. And even when he first exhibited this, people thought, well, this is aggressive, this seems misogynistic, and all of that is certainly baked into it. But he's also asking us to think about who he is as an artist, and what would have prompted this kind of art making. Now, before you get too cynical about this, we also have abstract expressionism from women artists too. This is a work called Re-Echo from 1957, painted by Lee Krasner. Lee Krasner is actually Jackson Pollock's, or was Jackson Pollock's widow. He had died in a car accident the previous year. And after that, who had been working for so long in his shadow, sort of came into her own and started to create these grand abstract expressionist paintings. This one has these bold kind of curving lines. It has these pinks and flesh tones in it. It almost feels like a human body, or a reference to things that are like growing or flowering or blossoming, rooted in the earth at the same time. So we have here a work it's re-echo, but it's also a little bit of rebirth. And so we have from Lee Krasner a work that feels kind of hopeful and organic here, as opposed to slashing and misogynistic. We have just one last abstract expressionist painting that I want to share with you tonight. This one is by the artist Mark Rothko, who is famous for his love of the color red and his use of stacked rectangles to sort of subtly maybe suggest a landscape. His rectangles oftentimes have these kind of blurry, glowing edges to them. And sometimes he painted on a grand scale. Oftentimes people think of his works as having a sort of spiritual quality to them. These are works where you're not there to wonder about his mark making per se, but to instead reflect on the impact that it has on you. People look at Mark Rothko's work, and the paintings seem to grow and expand and shrink as they are looking at them. This is a new kind of experience to have with painting here. Mark Rothko said that he was painting pure human emotion, ecstasy, tragedy, doom. See a little bit of doom in this one here. So we have Pollock and Krasner giving us, birth and creativity, and Rothko gives us contemplation and maybe even a hint of the sublime. We're going to switch gears now and go to things that are much more familiar, things produced in mass media. We're starting now with Jasper John's painting of the flag from 1955. This is an unusual painting in that it's encaustic painting, which means it's hot wax and pigment. We've got a little bit of texture here and a little bit of transparency. Jasper Johns actually painted this flag over a collage of newspaper articles. So you can just see like a little bit of it poking through. You kind of almost feel desperate to see what he's included here, what he's painted over, what he's obscured. And then you step back and you begin to wonder, is this a flag or is this a painting of a flag? How am I supposed to understand this? Is it patriotic? Is it ironic? essentially Jasper Johns took one of the most familiar, one of the most loaded symbols in American culture, and he drains it of its obvious meaning and instead turns it into a little bit of a visual puzzle. We're left to wonder about this sort of thing. When it comes to pop art, we don't get easy answers. And we see that's true with Andy Warhol, too. These are his 32 soup cans from 1962. He painted every single flavor that Campbell's produced at that time. So, what we are looking at are almost like mechanically reproduced images. They look like the real labels, right? And Andy Warhol, he always talked about how he wanted to be a machine. He had like little stamps for like these fleur de lis and that sort of thing. So he tried to be like a machine in how he created these paintings. And I always joke, nobody ever cried when they look at a Campbell soup can painted by Andy Warhol. This isn't about gesture. This isn't about the internal life or yearning of the artist. This is, well, what Andy Warhol says we're all about in the 1960s. We are about advertising, consumer goods, repetition, and brands. What has changed since the 1960s, I ask you? And Andy Warhol, a few months later produces Golden Marilyn shortly after Marilyn Monroe's death. He silk screens her face in a field of gold and he asks us to worship her like a Byzantine icon. Andy Warhol turned this movie star into a saint and reminded us that consumer culture is America's religion. I have just one last pop artist for you, and that is Roy Lichtenstein, whose work, even if you've never heard his name, you've probably seen these like blown up paintings of comic book pages. So he would take actual comic books and translate them as faithfully as possible, sort of like Andy Warhol with the Campbell soup cans, into very large format paintings that would then go in museums and galleries. So, how do you take this like low form of popular culture, something that's disposable? You throw away a comic book when you're done with it, and then translate it onto a canvas and suddenly say, no, this is valuable to who we are as people. So he would look at military war comics. This one's called Wham, and romance comics. This one's called Oh Jeff, I Love You Too. But and he would even translate those Ben-Day dots that were used for like printing different like shades of color in comics as well. And he did it all with a straight face. Again, not telling us if he's trying to be subversive in some way. He's just sort of saying, let's take a closer look. Let's spend some time with this. Now, I have two forms of protest art to wrap up this section. This work is by um, the artist Faith Ringgold, one of my favorites. And she was always very interested in using the American flag in her body of work. This one's called The Flag is Bleeding from 1967. It's a challenging painting to look at. We see these three figures here who have linked arms seemingly peacefully. They're standing on the other side of the flag. And if there wasn't all this blood, we might imagine that they were standing, that they were friends. But this flag is in fact bleeding. There is blood dripping from all of these red bars here. How do we make sense of this? Well, I would say these white figures in particular do not look disturbed at all by this blood. They look a little blasé about it, right? And notice now that the black figure here is the one that's holding the knife. So in some ways you think, okay, well, did he exact this violence? Well, he's also the only figure that is wounded. We can see that he's holding his hand over this wound and there's blood sort of spilling through his fingers here. He's also holding his hand in the position of saluting the American flag, sort of saying, in order to be an American, to pay tribute to this flag, it's like you have to get along despite the fact that you get wounded. You have to defend yourself. Essentially, Faith Ringgold is saying this is the cost of being Black in America. It's a really powerful image. One last piece of protest art for you, and this is Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. It took 5 years to do this epic dinner party here, and it was finished in 1979. Judy Chicago had this vision of creating this massive table with 39 place settings, and it's a triangle, so there's no head to the table. And the people who would be invited to this dinner party are great women from throughout history, going back to like ancient goddesses all the way up through like Georgia O'Keeffe. And at this dinner party, there would be handmade ceramic plates. There would be hand embroidered table runners. Judy Chicago, who we see from behind here, enlisted the help of all of these women to work on this project. And in doing so, she pointed out that these women, their names and their contributions are oftentimes overlooked or not even included in our histories. And she also pointed out that these traditional sort of women's crafts are oftentimes disregarded and dismissed by the art world as because of how they've been feminized. So with this monumental dinner party, Judy Chicago says, I'm inserting this all back into the canon, and it's in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum of Art if you wanted to go see it yourself. Now we have just a little bit of time. We're going to look at some diverse visions of what's happening in American art these days. And the idea here is we want to hear from as many people as possible and as many different modes of expression as possible. So we're going to get started with Felix Gonzalez Torres, and this is his untitled work, also known as Portrait of Ross in LA from 1991. We are looking at a pile of candy. It's 175 pounds of candy, in fact. And this is an installation that museums can buy and put in their contemporary galleries, and they invite people to come and take a piece of that candy. So you can imagine all day long, people are taking the candy, and the museum has to keep replenishing it to 175 pounds. So, what is the deal with this installation? Well, the artist was a gay man. He was living in LA, and his lover at the time was dying of AIDS, and his ideal body weight was 175 pounds. And Gonzalez Torres had to watch this man waste away. And so the idea for this installation was to make a faceless memorial out of sweet, ordinary things, and to invite public to participate in this, and to observe how this thing diminishes over time, to take a little sweet something with you to remember too. And the end result is this heartbreaking, sort of impactful, engaging work of art that invites us all to participate in it. This next artist here is named Nick Cave, and he is the innovator of the sound suit. This also originated right around the same time. Nick Cave was essentially traumatized by watching the police beating of Rodney King in LA. And it made him feel particularly vulnerable as a Black man. And he started thinking about, like, is there a way to completely obscure my identity, to wear something that doesn't betray the fact that I'm Black or the fact that I'm a man? So he innovates these sound suits, which do make noise, but they're also just made out of everyday things like sequins or hair or twigs or buttons, whatever. They become these incredible visual spectacles, and it becomes like a performance when you put it on. And what he is essentially doing is using invisibility here, as a way to protect himself. This is like the most elaborate armor you could imagine here. But he also summons joy in the process, and he creates this incredible spectacle, all while trying to kind of divorce himself from his identity. Now, this next artist, Kehinde Wiley, would never want a Black man to be invisible. Kehinde Wiley like came crashing on the art scene in the early 2000s as an artist who was really interested in inserting Black men into the art historical canon. This is his painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps. This is also at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. So here we have Kehinde Wiley thinking of a historical painting of Napoleon from the 1800s and thinking, Black men never get to play these roles in the history of art. They are never the generals. They are never the aristocrats, the kings. They never get to like be on top of a horse this way. And so in Kehinde Wiley's mind, he's correcting this history by painting these men who are embodying these roles in such a wonderful way. Now, Wiley became world famous sort of overnight because he painted that very memorable portrait of President Obama in front of the bushes. Now, the artist who painted Michelle Obama is Amy Sherald, and she's definitely having a moment right now. Amy Sherald is also a portrait painter specializing in portraits of Black and Brown people. She has an unusual approach to painting them, though. Her approach is, as a Black woman, she believes that the very fact of brown skin is so political in our culture today that we can't actually see the person underneath the skin. So she started painting Black and brown people with grayscale skin so that when we look at them, we can engage with who they are and not the fact of their blackness or brownness. There was a fair amount of controversy that the first Black first lady would have gray skin in the portrait gallery, but I think her ability to also like bring joy to these images with the bright colors, and in this case, a gorgeous dress too, has made her a really celebrated figure in the art world today. But believe it or not, there's no one more celebrated than Yayoi Kusama. She is Japanese-born American artist. She's been around since the 1960s as a pop artist. Andy Warhol stole some ideas from her. She has also very publicly struggled with mental illness her whole life, and she used to have these hallucinations where everything was covered in polka dots. And in recent years, she started making these mirrored infinity rooms, and people will stand in line for hours, for 30 seconds inside of one of these mirrored infinity rooms, because Kusama offers something like pure experience here. It's total immersion. This isn't like a Mark Rothko where you sit back and contemplate it. This is art that invites you in. One of our last artists is Jeffrey Gibson, who's also having a moment these days. Jeffrey Gibson is a Native American artist, and he's also a gay man. And he uses his art to sort of address issues that are personally important to him. He creates art sort of using traditional like beading techniques of his Native American tribe, and he creates these over life-size costumes that he wears and he performs in sometimes too, but they're oftentimes on display in galleries like we see here. And they have these bright, vivid colors. They're sort of like over the top. And part of that is like the celebration of his sexuality here too. He has become very famous for these punching bags that he's created. They're in all sorts of museum collections. This one says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." It's a little bit of talk from our or text from our founding documents. Can you imagine what it would feel like to punch that punching bag, and why maybe as a gay Native American man he might feel inclined to do so? So we're going to wrap up with just one last work. And this is an installation by a Jamaican-born American artist named Nari Ward. It's called We the People, another work with text from our founding documents. And it is an installation that's made simply of shoelaces, fat, skinny, long, all sorts of different colors. It's a democratic medium here, and he crowdsources it. So the end result here is a We the People that seems to include everyone, also pointing out the fact that that was not always the case. It's a large scale installation, and I think without being naive, it's a hopeful one as well. We'll just do a very quick conclusion here. We've seen all sorts of images over the 250 years of America's history, depicting power, redistributing power. The journey is not finished. American art still remains a living conversation about who we've been, who we are, and who we can become together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. This was so fascinating. The development, the evolution of American art through the centuries. I mean, so fascinating.
It was a lot to take on for 1 hour.
Yes, I mean, you really like the development and, all the different voices that came into American art and how it expanded, evolved, changed. So fascinating. I cannot thank you enough. Wonderful. I
Thank
learned
you.
so much, and I want to stop the recording now and then open it up for question and answers. Again, thank you very much.
Thank
Wonderful.
you. I did get a private message and